Hello, this is Dr. Paul Riley, and here is an audio summary of the first half of Lecture 3 on MS 7039 on social media and social unrest in the UK. You'll remember in this class we had a number of learning objectives, and just to go over these briefly, the first was to look at the role that social media plays in the organisation of social or civil unrest, such as the August riots in England in 2011, and also thinking more specifically about some of the issues in relation to policing, looking at the concept of surveillance, of inverse surveillance, and how social media could be used by protesters or eyewitnesses to hold the police to account for their actions during riots or these situations. And finally, to think about how the police themselves use social media during these crisis situations. To go over briefly the concept of surveillance, which was critical to the first half of the class, this effectively is watching the watchers. It's a form of essentially turning the camera back on the police or authority figures and to scrutinise them. It originated from Steve Mann's work in the late 1990s, where he explored the use of wearable computing, and it very much had a view this empowered the user, that allowed them to log what was happening around them. The personal surveillance, the first of the two forms we looked at, is very much about first-person perspectives, capturing your everyday life with no political agenda perhaps. The hierarchical form is what we were particularly interested in when we talked about the Stokes-Croft riot, which I'll talk about in a second. And this was about an overtly political act where someone would record the actions of the police and share it on sites like YouTube. And clearly with Web 2.0, this is intensified with the use of smartphones to collect this data and to share it instantly online. The Stokes-Croft so-called anti-Tesco riot was our first case study, and I'll talk about this in this particular recording. This was an area which was characterised by a campaign against the opening of a Tesco supermarket in the area. This campaign had a lot of social media activity, and the opening of the Tesco store was seen as crucial to the riot on the 21st of April 2011, when violence broke out in the aftermath of a police operation to evict squatters from a building across the road from the Tesco store, which they claimed were a threat to public order because they were creating petrol bombs to be thrown at the Tesco store. Local residents, as we saw in the class, were very much angered by this suggestion, denied suggestions that it was linked to Tesco, as had been alleged in the mainstream media, and suggested that the police operation had been heavy-handed and contributed to the violence. You'll remember we looked at an example of the video footage, and there were hierarchical and personal forms of surveillance evident. In terms of hierarchical, which was the subject of my study, there were lots of footage of people saying to other eyewitnesses, film what the police are doing, film everything. That a lot of the footage showed the police presence in the area, so this ranged from the riot police lining up on the streets, charging at people who were in the streets, to the convoy of police vehicles, and of course the helicopter which was flying over the area until 5 in the morning, which was the subject of much criticism by local residents on sites like Indie Media. And very importantly, in terms of the local residents and their framing of what had happened, there were videos which appeared to show unprovoked attacks by the police on people who happened to be in the area. So some evidence to support their view. Of course, when we talk about surveillance, somebody may well record what is a non-politicised act, a personal viewpoint, and it can be transformed into hierarchical surveillance. And there was lots of content in this study, and we saw a video in the class, which could be defined as either personal surveillance or citizen journalism. And this took many forms. One was, in several videos, people recorded interviews with people who were in the area at the time, both during and after the riot on the 21st of April. This included the squatters, who put forward a very different version of events than those put forward by the police. We see the camera focusing on individuals in the crowd, for example, a saxophonist or someone dancing in the street or a busker feature quite regularly in some of this footage. Again, perhaps suggesting people were recording what was around them. We see a lot of people watching, people from second floor apartments looking out and just recording what was happening in the street. And this very much speaks to the blurring of the distinction between citizen journalism and surveillance, that many of these videos could be characterised as all of these. You'll remember we went over some of the key findings from my study, and the YouTube comments and how people made meaning of this footage was very important to that study. And the results suggested that only a very small minority felt that this was hierarchical surveillance, that this was put up to check the behaviour of the police. A lot of the anger was directed towards the people who were rioting, so this wasn't the police. The police actually received a lot of sympathy, and most of the criticism of the policing as such was about whether their tactics were sufficient to protect private property, and whether they should have used perhaps more aggressive tactics of crowd control to stop the violence captured on camera. And very much despite local residents using these YouTube comments to articulate the reasons why they opposed the Tesco campaign and to again stress that this was not linked to the violence on camera, there was very little rational debate. A lot of mainstream media narratives suggesting this was a Tesco campaign that had turned violent were reproduced by commenters. You'll remember we also then turned to talk about how did the police respond to civil unrest, particularly in the August riots of 2011 in cities such as London, Birmingham and Manchester. And we referred to the Reading the Riots study, and in particular the Reading the Riots on Twitter study, which suggested that yes, there were quite wild, outlandish rumours and misinformation circulating on Twitter, but in many cases, thinking of the London Eye being on fire, or about zoos being broken into and animals roaming the streets of parts of London, that a lot of these rumours were actually corrected by members of the public and the police. One thing we did point to was a lot of the media framing of social media as very integral to this. Well, we suggested that yes, BlackBerry Messenger and Twitter were used by people to perhaps accelerate rumour and to bring people onto the streets, but Reading the Riots did suggest that this was also something which the traditional media played a role in, with many of the people who participated in the project, who claimed to have been involved in the looting or the rioting of that week in August, saying that television footage had said to them that the police had lost control, and this may have contributed to the violence as well. Also, social media playing a very important role in terms of not just quelling rumours and misinformation, but also in providing information to residents about areas that would be affected, and also being used to organise clean-up operations where local communities responded to what had happened by organising efforts to clean up their areas. We also looked at how the police might use this, and use social media in particular to provide accurate information to people in areas affected by civil unrest, and how they respond to the use of social media to spread rumours and misinformation. And this study by Jeremy Crump, which is on the reading list, is quite an important one to read. He points to perhaps a degree of cautious experimentation, but perhaps with a lot of fear over the potential harm to the reputation of individual officers, as the reasons why perhaps social media has not been used to its fullest potential as a tool of engagement with the public. That while it can be used to provide real-time information, and there were many examples of this in the August riots in 2011, that by and large it was used as another channel to talk to the public, but that it was very unlikely to replace the grassroots real-time policing operations which involved officers going into these communities, so that its strength might be very much about publicising these activities rather than replacing them. Just to conclude, one thing that was very clear from the Stokes-Croft example was that it's very difficult to control social media use. A lot of the footage uploaded to YouTube by eyewitnesses to the Stokes-Croft riots in April 2011, there was very little the police could do in response to that. That the police often in August 2011 were responding to misinformation, were trying to provide accurate information, but often there was a lag in time between these rumours spreading and the police being able to respond. But there were many examples of good practice. I referred to several in the lecture, such as the Leicestershire Constabulary actually following groups of youths around the city centre, around the High Cross Centre, and observing what they were doing and providing information to shopkeepers and other groups via social media to suggest that there was no threat. They'd been talking to these groups and there was no likelihood of violence being perpetrated. But clearly there remains a tension perhaps between how open social media is and perhaps how relatively closed the police may be, and this reputational risk is perhaps something which holds back the police from using it in ways which may increase public engagement. And very much social media is something which should be seen as supportive of the traditional ways in which the police engage with members of the public. Thank you.